Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this important occasion. This is, I think, the third, certainly it's the second in my time as Chancellor, Malcolm Fraser Oration. I wish to welcome especially Tammy Fraser. It's wonderful to see you here again, and her family. And I welcome also Geoff Raby's mother. Welcome, Mrs. Raby. At 103, I hope you'll be here for many more Malcolm Fraser orations. As is customary, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet this evening, and I acknowledge their elders, past and present. Our orator, this is an oration, our orator this evening is Dr. Geoff Raby. Geoff was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. Before that, he had long and distinguished public service, especially diplomatic service in the interests of Australia. So after 27 years in the public service, when he completed his term in China, he resigned and established Geoff Raby and Associates, a Beijing-based strategic advisory company. And that's occupied a great deal of Geoff's time since his resignation from his public service positions. He's chair of Western Sydney University's Australia-China Institute of Arts and Culture, and a member of the board of the Garvan Foundation. He is and has been the member of boards of many Australian listed companies. He's a graduate of La Trobe University, and we're especially honoured, therefore, that he's come to this foreign part. His support for La Trobe University has been very distinguished. His philanthropic support includes the donation of a very distinguished collection of Chinese contemporary art. He's published many academic articles and is the author of 3 books. The latest, and I imagine most of you read it at Christmas, was China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New World Order, published by Melbourne University Press, I should say. As a public intellectual, he's contributed to the debate about Australia's relations with China and its foreign policy stance in many respects otherwise. Geoff has been honoured by Chile. He's a member of a very distinguished order of that country, the Bernardo O'Higgins order, and he was awarded membership of that order some years ago, and it's the highest accolade that Chile bestows on a foreign person. In 2010, he became La Trobe University's inaugural distinguished alumnus, and in 2022, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by Federation University. In recognition of his contributions to advancing relations between Australia and China and his contribution to multilateral trade diplomacy, and it was that Chile especially recognised as Geoff's achievement, he became an officer of the Order of Australia in June 2019. I invite Dr. Raby to address us.
Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, Tammy Fraser, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, many friends, and I should also now, after that introduction, Alan, recognise the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University, John Dewar, as well. I wish at the outset to recognise the original custodians of the land on which where we are this evening, the Wurundjeri people, and their elders past, present and emerging. It is a great, and I must confess, most unexpected honour to be invited to give the Melbourne University Malcolm Fraser Oration and to be here this evening. When the Chancellor, Alan Myers, approached me with his kind invitation on behalf of the university, I could hear my own voice rising in pitch and starting to squeak. Me? Why me? I tried to find a means of escape, but Alan's a tricky character, and being one of Australia's leading QCs, I knew that my chances were not very good. So it's not that I didn't feel the occasion worthy, far from it. To the contrary, I recognise its singular importance, but also how daunting the task. How can one do justice to such a dominant figure in Australian political history? One who never shirked controversy if he was convinced of the correctness of the course. And one who constantly confounded critics by being impossible to stereotype. A conservative, a liberal, an egalitarian from a privileged background, a strong believer in social justice and racial equality, a humanitarian, and much more. I had only two personal encounters with Malcolm Fraser. One, indirectly via my maternal grandmother, who lived to 98. She was from the Osborne family in Port Fairy and Yambuk in the Western District. They were English-Scottish immigrants who came in the 1860s. Many are laid to rest in the Port Fairy Cemetery. They were small shopkeepers and publicans. The Church of England in Port Fairy still has one stained glass window today, which was donated by the Osborne family. My grandmother idolised Malcolm as Prime Minister. She would tell us the story of how when Malcolm's grandfather and family would occasionally visit their church, the entire congregation would stand up as the Fraser family walked the length of the nave to take up their pews at the front. It was almost a caricature of the Western District squattocracy, but my grandmother loved it and she thought it was so grand. She was a true believer. The other was when Malcolm paid me a great honour and attended my Richard Larkin's oration for Monash University in August 2012. At that time, as a recently retired ambassador to China and former public servant, I was attracting some notoriety, you might say, at the time, for my public criticisms of the Gillard government's handling of our relations with China. Malcolm attended the oration on a cold Melbourne winter's evening. Afterwards, he engaged me in vigorous discussion of the main lines of my argument, with which he was in firm agreement. My essential points were then, as now, that Australia needs to learn how to live with China as the dominant power in the region, that we cannot just rely on the US to look after our interests, and so Australia needs to craft an independent foreign policy which recognises that our interests do not always and completely align with those of the US. It was an unforgettable moment for me that we were discussing these issues and were in violent agreement in the State Library of Melbourne that evening. Me with the former Minister for the Army, against whom I used to demonstrate regularly during the Vietnam War in the very streets outside the State Library of Victoria. Discussing this oration with former Prime Minister Paul Keating, soon after accepting the invitation, Keating commented that Malcolm Fraser was indeed a strong and forceful leader, one who held many ideas firmly. Keating then said, some of which were, however, not always correct. I've actually expressed that rather more politely than Paul Keating did. Keating was no doubt referring to the dismissal, which cast so much refracted light on Fraser's prime ministerial and subsequent careers. Yet, as Keating said of other Australian political leaders, there's no point having the job if you don't do anything with it. Certainly no one can accuse Malcolm of inaction, and perhaps nowhere was his political activism and leadership more apparent than in international affairs, including anti-racism, his singular contribution to the ending of apartheid in South Africa, and the environment, with, among other things, the banning of whaling in Australia and prohibiting sand mining on Fraser Island. And remember, in the 1970s, the environment was just beginning to emerge as a matter of global concern and action. Today, the world is changing more rapidly than we can comprehend. We are living through a time when the verities of the old global order are disappearing. Australia needs to chart a path in the new multipolar global order in which democracies are under populist threat internally and autocratic states are asserting themselves, and global rules and institutions are under challenges from many sides. At such times, strong, unsentimental leadership focused on Australia's national interests is required. This national imperative is the subject of this evening's oration, and it is appropriate to remind ourselves of two of Fraser's key contributions to Australia's place in the world: an appropriate response to the treatment of refugees and the need for an independent Australian foreign policy. As in his time, today these are matters of statecraft that present some of the severest tests for political leadership. When I was first in the embassy in Beijing in the 1980s, and then again as ambassador, as just mentioned kindly by Alan, I built a substantial collection of Chinese contemporary art. Apart from its intrinsic technical merit, and in the early days, affordability, which was very helpful on a first secretary salary, I was attracted to it as a mirror of the deep and profound social and political changes surging through the country's sinews as China's leaders pursued policies of economic reform and opening to the world beyond. The first naive wave of this period crashed when the tanks and troops of the PLA stormed Tiananmen Square on the evening of the 3rd of June and crushed the months-long student and citizens' protests on 4th of June. I was still in our embassy then. At the time, Prime Minister Hawke was traumatised by the reports and images he was seeing from the square. He had built close personal relations with China's leaders, including Party Secretary Zhao Ziyang. Senior Vice Premier Wan Li was a regular tennis partner whenever they met. Hawke embraced China's new openness and saw the immense potential for Australia in this. He firmly believed it would continue to unfold. And then, on that fatal weekend in June, it was snuffed out. Hawke was devastated. Famously, in his memorial address some days later at the Great Hall of Parliament House, he wept as he read embassy accounts of the atrocities. Then, to everyone's surprise, he announced that all Chinese students in Australia, or who were about to come to Australia, could stay as permanent residents. Many years later, when I was ambassador, Hawke, on his frequent visits, would sometimes drop by for a cup of tea and a catch-up. On one occasion, Hawke became distracted by my collection of Chinese contemporary art that was on the walls of my official residence. On previous visits, he had not shown any interest. This time, as we chatted, he kept looking at the works and showing more interest in them than in our conversation. I guess that says a lot about my side of the conversation. I explained to him that the works on show in the residence were only by artists who had lived and worked in Australia, though many had since returned to Beijing. I then asked if he realised that he was personally responsible for many of them and their subsequent careers. Suspicious that I might have been having a piece of him, he growled, "What did you mean?" I explained that many of the artists had either stayed on in Australia or arrived soon after Tiananmen Square. Their stay was in Australia because of him, and it was in Australia where their careers began. As we toured the collection, Hawke became quite emotional, as was his way. He turned to me and he said that as Prime Minister, one gets few genuine opportunities to lead. There was cabinet, bureaucratic departmental advice, staffers all over Parliament House that needed to be accommodated. He said the decision on the Chinese visas was his own and only his own, and he stuck with it despite tremendous opposition from within his government. With tears welling, he said to me it was one of his moments of personal leadership, unencumbered by the structures of government. And so it was for Malcolm Fraser with his decision on China refugees. Yet Hawke's decision on Chinese students was more emotionally charged and driven than Fraser's on Indo-Chinese refugees. As a leader of the trade union movement before entering Parliament, Hawke had earlier campaigned against Indo-Chinese refugees, as was the tradition in the labour movement as it sought in a reflex populist response to protect jobs of Australian workers. Malcolm Fraser, when opposed by his Minister for Immigration, Michael McCallum, carrying advice from the Immigration Department, told him, Fraser to McCallum, Australia just had an ethical obligation. We were fighting alongside these people in Vietnam. This simple, principled approach to leadership, based on a clear understanding of Australia's moral obligations, resonates today in the wake of the Afghanistan debacle. Hawke's decision on allowing students to remain directly involved 16,200 at the time of his announcement. Eventually, 42,000 received permanent resident visas. Fraser's was on a vastly larger scale altogether. Beginning in 1977, refugees arriving in Australia by boat started as a trickle, but soon grew to as many as several boats a day. Immigration facilities were being overwhelmed. The Immigration Department put forward a cabinet submission proposing building, and this will sound familiar, detention centres and other measures to deter queue jumpers. Even Labor's immigration spokesman, Moss Cass at the time, he spoke of queue jumpers and called on the government not to tolerate their arrival. With respect to the advice to Cabinet from the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs that detention centres should be used and that the military should be tasked with turning back the boats, Fraser recalled that that suggestion was dispensed with in 30 seconds. He said that he thought it was a piece of racist barbarism. Instead, the government's response to queue jumping was to shorten the length of the queue by expanding the capacity of Australia to process refugees in the camps across Indochina. Now, this required enormous political leadership derived from moral conviction and courage. As Fraser explained, people are never going to say yes to a significant change in immigration, which is likely to result in people they do not know, whose backgrounds they do not understand, coming to this country in significant numbers. Fraser's position was clear. Immigration would always require leadership as well, and I find this very interesting comment by him, optimism, reassurance, and engagement by leaders. He said, I knew if I asked the people whether we should take in the Vietnamese, they would say no. I also knew that if we did it and explained how and why, then it would be accepted. This is precisely why this episode is now seen by many scholars as the first real test of the end to the White Australia policy. You recall that the Whitlam government abolished the White Australia policy in a formal sense, but this was the first time this was really tested. Perhaps the key to his success in this most contentious of policy areas where subsequent governments have failed is found in Fraser's own narrative, which he framed. He said, we had a deliberate approach in what we said in public. We never spoke about fear. We always spoke of tolerance, of diversity, and we planned carefully. In this, he showed that Australian governments were serious in leaving behind the conformity of British race patriotism and embracing the multicultural ideal. In other words, leaders can rally the public's better instincts if they have the political courage to do so. For short-term they can do that, or for short-term ambitions, they can stir the public's base instincts and xenophobia. Fraser's position was that the choice is up to the leader. But by the end of his government, almost 70,000 Indo-Chinese refugees have been settled in Australia. And as we see in our circumstances today, boat people, with all the attendant danger and risk the passage across the seas pose, accounted for a mere 2,059. Another figure Fraser would no doubt have been deeply satisfied over was that while Australia accounted for the fourth largest refugee intake in the world, after the US, Canada and France, and the latter two were not involved in the Vietnam War, on a per capita basis, Australia had taken the biggest number in the world. As Margaret Simons says in the political memoirs of Malcolm Fraser, while the Whitlam government formally abolished the White Australia policy, it was the Fraser government that gave substance to the ending of the White Australia policy. The Fraser government changed the ethnic mix of the Australian population forever, with subsequent inflow of additional refugees and family migration policies. Neither Hawke nor Fraser made their decisions on opening to refugees in these circumstances with an eye to future legacies. They did it as defiant acts of leadership because, quite simply, it was the right thing to do. Our leaders should think about this today and the character of Fraser when they fear public opinion and hear cautious, leaden, bureaucratic advice on why we must limit the number of Afghan refugees post the Taliban takeover. We are now being asked, in this case, to look after those who looked after and helped us. Today, we are taking over several years 13,000 out of an estimated 145,000 who served Australian interests over 20 years of war. Even if the government were to settle permanently all 145,000 as a share of Australia's population, it would not even be equivalent to the number of refugees initially settled from Indochina in the late 1970s. Let me now turn to Fraser and foreign policy. It's little remembered today that on his first trip overseas, accompanied by Tammy, as Prime Minister, Fraser chose to make Tokyo and Beijing his first destinations. This was a sharp break with convention. He was criticised by his colleagues for not making London and Washington initial ports of call. Tokyo was understandable. In 1973, Britain had joined the European Common Market, and Australia's major markets disappeared almost overnight. Japan was emerging as an economic force and potentially significant economic partner for Australia. Australian anti-Japanese feelings from the Second World War had largely ebbed away by the time the Fraser government was elected. But China then was of little more than boutique interest for Australian diplomacy. When the Whitlam government was elected in 1972, China had captured national attention for a while as the new Australian government recognised the People's Republic and withdrew from the Vietnam War. Led by the Nixon administration, a reordering of the global balance of power was taking place, with the US and China aligning more closely against the Soviet Union. Malcolm Fraser not only followed this shift, it lay at the heart of his government's foreign policy. He knew there was no going back to an earlier era. China at that time was poor, inward-looking, politically divided, anxious and threatened. When Fraser arrived, Mao was gravely ill and 3 months from his death. Fraser met with Hua Guofeng, who was to replace Mao. The destructive, insane decade of the Cultural Revolution was drawing to an end. Before it did so, however, one last final act had to be played out as Jiang Qing, Madame Mao, and her gang of 4 colleagues sought to usurp power. They, in turn, were arrested by the palace guards who remained loyal to Deng Xiaoping. It is this context that makes the Prime Minister's visit in 1976 even more remarkable when viewed from this historical distance. What was he thinking by making Beijing his second overseas stop after becoming Prime Minister? In this, we see a fundamental shift in Fraser from foreign policy ideologue to foreign policy realist. As he said in 1976, ideology should not shape foreign policy. But during the Vietnam War, he had been one of the most hardline ideologues in cabinet in support of a war which was both illegal and immoral. For Fraser, it was a Machiavellian choice, good versus evil, communism versus the free world. He breathed the same Cold War warrior fire as his colleagues. To watch on TV the last US helicopters flee from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon, the desperate plight of those left behind, the US retreating across the Pacific Oceans to far distant shores, all had a profound impact on his view of the reliability of the US as the ultimate guarantor of Australian security. For those that saw great powers in ideological terms, as he once did, this came as a profound shock. and with it came the realisation of one of the oldest truths in international relations. Great powers, above all else, pursue their own interests, as indeed they must. And at times, these can be very narrowly conceived. And for the rest of us, we do what we can. Fraser's visit to Beijing then marked the point at which he recognised that no matter how important and enduring the US alliance might be, Australia still needed to make its own way in its region and find its security, as Keating would say many years later, within the region, not from the region. China also served another purpose for this rapidly maturing realist Prime Minister. It would be a bulwark against the great and ever-present threat of the Soviet Union. As James Curran writes in his forthcoming study of how Australian Prime Ministers have managed this China relationship, for Fraser, China represented an armful of red arrows to be used against the Soviet Union. Fraser's approach to China was, in many ways, a continuation of Whitlam's, which Fraser had roundly condemned while in opposition. Fraser made the policy bipartisan as Prime Minister, though it was not without its staunch critics in his own party. Australia would need to place priority on managing its relations with East Asia, including with a potentially powerful, dominant China. From now on, for Australia, it would be the East Asia region first, while maintaining alliance relations with the US. No longer would it be US first and only the US. As all Prime Ministers should do, and in Australia most have done so, he placed great importance on foreign policy. He did so based on principle, not expediency. In later years, when speaking on the role of Prime Ministers, he said that if you are interested in a better world, then you have to be interested in foreign policy. He also said that ideology should not shape foreign policy. From this time, Fraser in his speeches returned repeatedly to his emerging realist doctrine in foreign policy. While Australia must always look to its interest, as would its enemies, dialogue should always be possible. Whatever the disagreements between states, Fraser believed it was imperative to search for common interests. Today, the Australia-China relationship is at its lowest point ever. Among countries that share Australia's commitment to open, liberal democratic values, Australia is an outlier in its relations with China. Only Australia has had its official relationship with China suspended for more than 2 years. That has denied Australia the possibility of seeking to influence China's official thinking and behaviour. It has also meant that Australia's voice to speak up for injustices and on behalf of Australians held in detention has been silenced. Recent quantitative research by the Australia-China Policy Research Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, shows that out of a peer group of 10 like-minded countries, Australia is indeed an outlier in the low or nil official contacts it has had with China since 2016. Simply, other like-minded countries, even where they have historical or outstanding territorial disputes with China, and we have none, have managed their relationship more adroitly than Australia has been able to do. The problem with the current approach of strategic competition is that we harm our interests while not being able to advocate for liberal values. It is a lose-lose strategy. It fails the test of pragmatism while not advancing our principles. It is the role of diplomacy to square the circle, as it were, to find win-win outcomes in complex and difficult circumstances. How then do we deal with a rising assertive China? Does Malcolm Fraser's realist approach, based on a combination of interests and principles, provide guidance to this major public policy challenge? I believe it does, and that Fraser would have handled the relationship very differently than governments today. First, he would have favoured continued dialogue and engagement. He would have emphasised the central role of diplomacy over confrontation, of diplomats over the military and intelligence communities. Second, he would have focused on our common and shared interests and on opportunities that would arise from cooperation. He would have disciplined his cabinet ministers to focus on these things and not the things that divide us. He would not shy away from acknowledging our differences, nor from advocating human rights and other liberal values. But importantly, he would not let these things define the relationship in the intellectually lazy way they do today. Third, as a realist, he would acknowledge openly the rise of China and its ever-growing influence over first regional and then global affairs. While acknowledging the central role of the US in maintaining stability in our region, he would temper this with an unsentimental view that the US will only do so when it is clearly in its own interest to do so. He would not rely on past shared experience, on whimsical notions of 100 years of mateship and forever partners. He would know that the UK is a very long way from our region in East Asia, with few interests and even fewer capabilities. He most definitely would not associate Australia with a romantic alliance of several Anglophone countries against China. He already understood a long time ago that Australia needed to look beyond the US alliance for its security, and that the UK had long departed the region and would not return, other than rhetorically, as we see with the new AUKUS grouping today. Fraser's first trip as PM, way back in 1976, showed that he understood that Australia's security needed to be found in our region. He knew, as he said at the time, that the world had changed forever. Fourth, he would understand that we need to make our own way in the region, and that our foreign and security policies will need to reflect both our geography and our interdependence with the region. As the most powerful regional actor, China would be the key to our regional diplomacy. He would be open about that and would lead public opinion in Australia to understand that even if we dislike or abhor what sometimes happens in China and China's behaviour beyond its borders, Australia needs to find its own way of engaging with China in Australia's own interests. He would take careful note that others have done so successfully without compromising their values. He would eschew naive notions that China could be remade in our image. He would give credit where credit is due and acknowledge China's standing in the world. He would also accept the reality that China's political system, while vastly different from our own and distasteful to many, could command widespread popular acquiescence or even support within China. As we've seen, Fraser was an activist and a leader in foreign policy. He believed that Australia could make a difference and should provide leadership internationally. In pursuing his foreign policy, he would want to ensure that Australia had its own house in order. He would emphasise traditional liberal principles, democratic institutions, freedom of the press, rejection of racism, and accountability of the security and military services to the Parliament, and openness to public scrutiny. There would be no secret trials. Supporting an international agenda to tackle climate change would be a major priority. In 1978, as I mentioned, he shut down the last whaling station, which was located near Albany in Western Australia, and in 1979 adopted a permanent ban on whaling, which continues today, thankfully. He would most definitely have understood and accepted Australia's responsibility not only to move to a low-carbon economy, but he would also have wanted Australia to show international leadership. He would, like Paul Keating after him, seek to strengthen Australia's regional relationships and work closely with countries in ASEAN to hedge against China. He would understand that hedging and reminding China that bad behaviour carried costs was different than containing China in the interest of perpetuating US global hegemony. With the US, Fraser would aspire to making Australia the indispensable regional ally, not by being the tip of the US spear against China, but because of the depth, strength, and utility of Australia's relations with all countries in the region, and most importantly, with China. Being an activist in foreign policy, Fraser would look at regional architecture and ask, is it fit for purpose? During his time as Prime Minister, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, PEC, developed into a significant 1.5-track forum with encouragement by both Australia and Japan. Fraser had together with the Japanese Prime Minister Ohira, jointly convened the inaugural PEC meeting in Canberra in 1980. PEC laid the foundations which enabled APEC to be established under the Hawke government in 1989. It is likely that Fraser would have come to view the East Asia region as the most dangerous in the world, with nuclear weapon states in China, Russia and North Korea riven by extant historical and territorial disputes. He would likely have been concerned about the absence of any security mechanism in the region. He would have seen that Australia could have a leading role in building consensus that promotes habits of dialogue among all regional states around security, including early warning mechanisms, hotlines, dispute management, arms control, and the elimination of certain types of weapons and norms for cyber and space engagement. Of course, to do any of these things to provide heightened security for Australia would require a fundamental repair of our broken relationship with China. Three vexed issues make such a repair job challenging: China's treatment of its Uyghur minorities in far western Xinjiang province, the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong, and China's continuous provocations towards Taiwan. In preparing this oration has led me to think about how Fraser would approach these significant issues based on a foreign policy of pragmatism and principle. In the case of Xinjiang, he would have placed great importance on knowing the facts and would see international concerted action as the way forward, as he did in leading arguments against apartheid in South Africa. But he would avoid internationally inflammatory language, such as the reckless use of the term genocide. He would look to involve a wide range of countries, especially from our region and the developing world, in putting pressure on China to be more transparent and accountable for events in Xinjiang. With Hong Kong, he would start from the position that it was China's sovereign territory after it was handed back by the British in July 1997, and that the 50-year transition period was just that, a transition period. From a pragmatic stance, he would most likely have concluded that the violent demonstrations and chaos of 2019 and the calls for independence by some of the demonstrators nullified the transition period. Most importantly, he would have avoided being part of Anglosphere condemnation of China to assist the British government's efforts to internationalise the issue, which really is a matter between London and Beijing. Finally, on Taiwan, Fraser would be forthright in advising the US about the limits to Australia's support if military action took place involving the US. He would have stuck with the long-standing position of Australian governments, which now seems to be abandoned by the current government's infatuation with the military, that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would not require a response under the ANZUS Treaty. Australia would therefore evaluate the circumstances before deciding what, if any, involvement there would be alongside the United States. These are all positions consistent with foreign policy leadership based on pragmatism and principle, but coming from a philosophically conservative politician who led the conservative side of politics for many, many years. In his last book, published in 2014 and co-authored with Kane Roberts, Dangerous Allies, Fraser set out a coherent account of more than a century of Australian foreign policy thinking based on the concept, as he termed it, strategic dependence, or as Alan Gingell later described it in the title of his own book, The Fear of Abandonment. Both refer to Australia's obsolete yet obdurate foreign policy based on the faith that a great power with whom we share values, first Britain and then the United States, would guarantee Australia's security. Of course, we know that the only time our strategic dependence on a great and powerful ally was fully tested, or tested at all, the British abandoned us in Singapore. In the case of the US, strategic dependence has led Australia into one futile, costly war after another at the side of the US. The latest, of course, is the debacle in Afghanistan. Highly relevant to the tensions now besetting Europe and the Western alliance, and more generally besetting Europe and the Western Alliance more generally today in the Ukraine, Fraser was critical of the US, especially the Clinton administration, for losing the peace when the Cold War ended. He extended that critique to Australia also for not having seized the moment to bring strategic dependence to an end and forge a genuinely independent foreign policy. Fraser did not live to see the heightened tensions that emerged in US-China relations during the Trump administration and which continue today, albeit with more muted language. A lot has changed in the 8 years since Dangerous Allies was published. Rereading it now, one may feel that Fraser might have been too accommodating of a rising, assertive China. Of course, in that, he was not alone at the time. But he would have been deeply disturbed in the way that Australia has followed the US into superpower confrontation as the US's chief enforcer on China. He would be appalled by Australian bragging that has been at the vanguard of pushing back against Beijing. His prescription then, as now, remains vital to Australia's future. He would urge leaders to seek out a more independent foreign policy stance from great powers, work with smaller powers as best we can, understand what the security concerns of the great powers are, and seek to find ways to accommodate them without conflict or conceding our own interests. And he would always speak boldly of our views equally to all great powers. To conclude, today's Australia is hard to recognise to that which Fraser had helped shape. Today our worldview is narrower, more fearful, inward-looking and mean. Australian governments have for many years taken Australia in directions that appeal to the mob, but not to our better instincts. It takes no courage and thus no leadership to stoke fear of the other, to set the community on edge, to find threats and enemies at every turn. It takes little effort to craft a foreign policy which at its core depends entirely on a foreign power to look after us. Strategic dependence, as Fraser called it. But what if that power one day decides it doesn't want to or can't look after us anymore, or it may never had any real intention to do so? We're not much more than 2 years away from the real possibility that Donald Trump, or even someone more reckless, may be elected as President of the United States. Do we then just hang on for the ride, wherever it takes us? This studied neglect of how America's internal travails may affect its global and regional posture and our own security is deeply disturbing. Where Fraser understood that the end of empire meant Australia had to find its own way in the region as a confident middle power that took control of its own destiny, today we rush to succor post-Britain fantasies of return of global Britain. Following the US defeat in Vietnam, Fraser over the years came to doubt increasingly US resolve and its reliability as a guarantor of Australia's security. Donald Trump's vigorous unilateralism, America first, and open disdain for allies would not have surprised Fraser. And Biden's retreat from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, leaving a country that was to be rebuilt in ruins, would have been depressingly familiar to him. Australia's failure to look after those in Afghanistan who looked after us would be viewed by Fraser as a serious lack of moral leadership. He would have no time for bureaucratic obstruction to serve short-term political ends. He would have mounted a concerted effort to accelerate checking and visa processing. He would have sought to marshal the other Western participants in Afghanistan to work together to do the same. He would have no truck with pettifogging when lives were at risk. Fraser gave substantive and lasting effect to the end of the White Australia policy, raised Australia's stature in the world through unstinting humanitarian acts, including championing the end of apartheid in South Africa and opposing racism everywhere. He accepted that Australia would need to ensure through active diplomacy its own security and understood that Australia's future was unalterably rooted in the Asia-Pacific. He believed that he personally and the nation as a whole had a moral obligation to show leadership to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure on your behalf to thank our orator. A remarkable speech we've just heard, based upon many years of experience, to which has been applied a thoughtful, and one might say wise mind, to draw out lessons for our country now. I'm sure Malcolm Fraser would have been surprised, but not disappointed, to know that one of these scruffy people who was cursing him outside the State Library was now a fervent admirer of his approach to foreign policy. But this is what maturity does for us, Geoff. Thank you very much. You've made a great speech this evening, which is the product of thought not only about our foreign policy, but in how to craft the oration tonight. It's both a tribute to Malcolm Fraser and a stirring invitation for us to think about how we approach China and how we formulate our foreign policy.